So, yet another way in which researchers can establish causality is by looking for something called parsimony. Right? I've already mentioned that when we analyze something, or when we consider a scientific question, one single study doesn't give a full answer to that question. We need to address a question from multiple points of view and from multiple directions, if you like. And researchers need to take into account the full pattern of all of these results of these different studies. Makes sense, right? So we're looking for the overall pattern. And when considering parsimony, right, parsimony is something that means simplicity. When considering the overall pattern, researchers look for the simplest explanation for this overall pattern. So I think Einstein said that a scientific theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? That means that taking into account the theory that makes the least amount of assumptions is likely to be the correct one. If there's some finding that comes up that can't be explained, then of course we need to make our theory more complex. But until then, the most simple, that means in other words, the most parsimonious theory is likely to be the correct one. So consider the following example. Right? When considering the relationship between smoking and lung cancer, right? Researchers have long noticed the association between smoking and lung cancer. Now, in order to truly establish a causal relationship, we'd need to do an experiment. That means that we'd have to have one group of people whom we let smoke for several years and one group of people who don't smoke for several years, for decades, and then see if the group that smokes for decades is has more lung cancer than the other group. Obviously, A, that would be a very long study, and B, that would be an unethical study. Yet, we're really quite certain about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Now, how can we be certain about this relationship if we haven't actually done an experiment with human beings like that? Well, because researchers have looked at the pattern of findings. Consider all of these different groups of findings. Right? We've established in lots and lots and lots of different studies that the longer a person has smoked cigarettes, that the greater the chances that they get cancers, lung cancer, and also other types of cancer. Consider that when people stop smoking, then their chance of getting cancer drops. Consider that, thirdly, smokers' cancer tends to be of a particular type, primarily lung cancer, also throat cancer, right? So it's also a particular type of lung cancer. So there's a specific set of cancers that appears to be associated with smoking, not cancer overall. Consider that smokers who use filtered cigarettes, as opposed to the ones that are unfiltered or the ones that you roll yourself, have a somewhat lower rate of cancer than smokers of unfiltered cigarettes. Consider that people who live with smokers, so breathe secondhand smoke, also have higher rates of cancer because of their passive exposure to the same chemicals, and there the extent to which the other person smokes influences their chance of cancer. So that's also right, just like with the longer a person has smoked, the greater the chances of getting cancer is. That's called a dose-dependent relationship. Like the more you smoke, the greater your cancer risk is. The more you're exposed to secondhand smoke, the greater your cancer risk is too. Now, and each of these sets of findings has been established by multiple studies. Now, of course, when these types of relationships first became known, the tobacco industry, brought up many objections to each set of these. So, well, what about any third variables? And it's true that when you just look at one of these, then you could say, well, what about, let's say, coffee consumption? What about, take this relationship. The longer a person has smoked cigarettes, the greater the chances of getting cancer are. Or what about coffee as a third variable? What if people who drink a lot of coffee smoke more and also have coffee cause their cancer? We haven't controlled for that, right? So how have you ruled that out? Well, of course, in the meantime, we've controlled for it, but there could be other variables, other third variables lurking behind this relationship. This is true. There could be other third variables lurking behind that relationship. But if you take into account all of these, the chances that there are some third variable lurking behind this and behind that and behind that and behind that, your third variable problem becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Right? So the chance that there is some kind of third variable problem behind all of these is just slim to none. Whereas if you have one theory that explains all of this, namely cigarette smoke toxicity, explains all of these findings in one single swoop. So we have one simple, parsimonious explanation that can explain all of this and more, by the way, in one single swoop. We don't have to have separate explanations for all of these different findings. In other words, cigarette toxicity is by far the most parsimonious explanation for all of these findings. So the more we know about this, the more cigarette toxicity just becomes the most parsimonious explanation for the entire pattern of findings. Right. So despite the fact that all of these are correlations, right, and so on all of these, directionality or potential third variables is in and of itself a problem. When we look at the overall pattern of findings, right, it just becomes very unlikely that directionality and third variable are still a problem, because that single explanation of cigarette toxicity is just such a powerful explanation for all of these, and more, by the way. For instance, we can, right, these are not the only findings, there are other findings, for instance, rodent experiments. Right, and we understand to a large degree the molecular mechanisms involved that cause cancer in cells, in which, cigarette smoke cause cancer in cells. Right, so we can be very certain about that, despite the fact that none of these have actually been shown in a experiment. Right, this notion again is called pattern and parsimony. So parsimony is just a different way of saying simplicity. Right, it's a way of saying the simplest explanation is likely the best one. A scientific theory should be as simple as possible, should make as little assumptions as possible, but it shouldn't make too few examples. Like Einstein said, a scientific theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? That's called pattern and parsimony. One mechanism, one causal path from smoking to lung cancer explains this all in one fell swoop. And the same goes for other findings, like the relationship between exposure to violence on TV and committing violence. Right? In that case, there are experiments that have been done, more like short-term experiments, not like years of exposure, that have allowed researchers to be more confident of the relationship between exposure to violence on TV in children and violent tendencies in children. So this is obviously very fundamental to the way that science works, right? We search for theories to explain findings, and again, the simplest theory should be the best one, or usually is the best one, but not too simple. If a theory turns out too simple, if there are findings that it can't account for, then we need to revise it, right? A theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. There is a problem with this in the way that this is communicated to the overall public in the popular media, right? The news is, of course, the reporting of new things. journalists are and other people in the popular press are unlikely to report yet another study has found a relationship between this and that. Right? And that means that many people who just rely on the popular press by necessity may get the wrong impression of science because they only read about, the latest research. In other words, in the popular press, there are of course plenty of responsible journalists, but journalists don't always fairly represent the importance of pattern and parsimony. Right? Not always do journalists represent the overall pattern of findings that is important. Of course, many do, but I've noticed, for instance, at a personal level, I've noticed that in the relationship between diet and health, for instance, that many times some new finding is reported as some kind of new thing that refutes all that we've known before. And obviously, one single finding doesn't refute all that's known before. Findings just aren't like that. They need to be, first of all, better understood through more studies, and they need to see how they fit in the overall pattern of finding. But more importantly, when journalists only report one study at a time, they don't represent this. They selectively present only part of the scientific process, and for some people, this may give people a wrong impression of the way that science works. And yeah, people are easily misled by these kinds of things. And I, for instance, have read many times on Facebook when a study is reported that people immediately jump to wrong conclusions. Of course, I'm not going to be the one to correct them, and such people are not likely to be corrected anyway, because people like jumping to the wrong conclusions. Right? They jump to the conclusions that support their own narrative, as we have already seen. But yeah, this does contribute to a misunderstanding of science by lay people, and that's unfortunate. But I don't see any easy solutions to that. Though I should once again emphasize that there are plenty of journalists who do point out the overall pattern of findings when relevant, and they do point out how a novel finding can fit in this pattern of findings, and do seek out input from scientists when they write their articles. Right. But yeah, pattern and parsimony is a guiding principle, an overall guiding principle in the scientific effort as a whole.